so you can basically have like this completely different functioning geometry that like is as good as what we use and what we think of as geometry. And all these lines, like there's no such thing as a straight line, they're all curves. And you have, but it's like a complete geometric system that can be used to prove any assertion that geometry can prove, that normal geometry can prove. So seeing this like different, like just kind of recognizing that you can have this, all of our ideas of like things like as simple as like lines and points and stuff, like we take that stuff to mean like we're, oh, this is kind of like, you know, the fair model of how to represent things. And you realize there's actually a completely different model that's as like it's a like provably exactly as like truthful as normal geometry is, but it works in a completely different way from how we think.
Hello and welcome to Adventures in Climbing Mount Sophia. This channel functions as a space to share conversations in pursuit of wisdom. The title is inspired by René Dumont. My name is Ken Lowry, and today I'm speaking again with Steve, as well as our new friend Shane. Steve and I spoke in the last video, and Shane has joined us following engagement on Twitter as well. Again, on this channel, I refrain from introducing the social roles of the individuals engaged in these adventures, so as to avoid identifying the person with his or her social role. In this adventure, Shane and Steve share some beautiful insights regarding patterns in math. We explore aspects of the self, and a rough sketch of base camp hangs in the mist, showing itself with every reference to identity. I had to go after about 2 hours, so the last section of this conversation continues without me. Thank you, and if you would be so kind, if you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe. There seems to be a lot of us coalescing on this journey of trying to answer some very significant questions in our own kind of verbiage, and there's this attempt of trying to pull us together. And you're talking about what maybe characterizes that a little bit, and he was saying, well, two things he brought up were your intention, right? Basically that your intention is pure, and then well, let's just go with that one. I was mentioning that I am hoping to put a part of my YouTube channel as tools, right? Because I'm using the metaphor of mountain climbing. And
you have a base camp.
base camp is, yeah, we can maybe, yeah, we can outline base camp here in a minute. That would be fun. But maybe the primary tool that I want to put on as number one is tell the truth, or at least don't lie, which is kind of the same as that intention, right? There's the aspect of, because, and maybe I mentioned this in our video last time, Steve, of there's the levels of speaking the truth. And once you engage at the top level, your intentionality is almost not kind of necessarily pure, because you're attempting to take everything internal and communicate it in a way that is exactly optimal to represent what you see. That's obviously totally impossible, but you're doing the best you can.
Yeah. Another way to think about that is that anytime you lie, you're kind of creating a projection. So if you're trying to get to deeper levels of understanding, you have to tell the truth, or else you're just like, you know, stepping onto more and more projections. So yeah, definitely.
It's an active like blinding of your own sight to do that, because yeah. Were you guys talking about that from like a process individual level, or like from the cultural level? Because, you know, there's the cultural level of why these conversations are happening, and, you know, how many people are on this journey. And that's something that I'm just super interested in, but totally removed from. I've been kind of doing, I've been a hermit, and I'm coming out into the world now. So I don't know how much of the world's been doing that too, what's going on.
Yeah. I'm the same way. I mean, I read about a bunch of crap and stuff, but for me it's all been like, I haven't, I've never been part of a group or ever like like anything that I've had has always just like been like any conversation's been just among friends, or like definitely like I somewhat serious about like investigating these things, but like I'm still kind of casual to an extent about it, just because I don't know I feel like I make just as much progress being very serious about it as just kind of like daydreaming about it. Like it almost doesn't really, for me at least, like I feel like when I read books about it versus just like think about it, I don't really see that much difference in like the way that I grow.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's actually a really good aspect to bring up of this whole movement that we're talking about is the movement into becoming real, and becoming real in the sense that you're utilizing every aspect of the human experience to its highest potential in your own experience. So that doesn't like necessarily in that space you move beyond simply the analytical mind, where we've been so conditioned to stay and so convinced that that's the place to rely upon. But now you're kind of moving into the space where you, and this has an interesting connection to not lying. So John Vervaeke makes and it's not his, but he's where I interacted with it, is the distinction between the imagination and the imaginal. And the way I understand it is that your imagination is the place you go to create fantasies to escape from reality. Whereas the imaginal is a similar kind of place, but you don't go there to escape. You go there to like take the constructs of reality that you already see in your mind and play with them in different ways, such that, almost like the daydreaming you're talking about, it affords you a better grasp of reality.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like when I was talking earlier, I didn't explain that well. I kind of more think that like, as opposed to like more of a matter of like personal investigation rather than like trying to like, I don't know, take all these different sources and try to bring them all together and doing all that sort of thing. Like I feel like when it comes to this, it's hard for me to take other people's truths, especially from just writing, like from conversation. I feel like it's a lot more effective. But like when I read things like that are kind of on this topic, like I feel like it's very difficult for me to like really get anything out of it, because I think so much of it is like very highly personal. Like all you're reading is that guy's perspective of how he got to where he got. And so that path that he took might not bring you to the same destination, because along the way, all those like little moments that you have during the like that learning process like inform your understanding and stuff. And so if you have a very different set of experiences for these events to tie into, it's going to teach you different lessons.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, so for me, I've always kind of, well, it's kind of funny because like I've joked about this, but it's not really joking, that the reason that when I went to college I studied math and computer science is because I didn't want to read textbooks. I wanted to just do something that I could like get the kind of foundations for, and then the rest of the work was just on me for building that into like a deep understanding. So I
you're a first principles thinker.
I think so. I think that, but I also like to kind of, very loose with my thinking, especially when it comes to this sort of stuff. Like, I think I do a lot of as if believing. Like, I think it's like the foundation. My like real belief is I don't really have any idea, but I kind of like pretend that I think something for a variable amount of time, and I just kind of like, as if I believe in like a very literal interpretation of the Bible for a while, or as if I believe, that it's purely some sort of simulation or whatever the like viewpoint is. So that's kind of how I've always approached things. Is it's kind of like, I guess that's kind of a not honest with yourself, like what we were describing earlier. So maybe that's a doomed approach, but that's kind of how I've been approaching it.
Well, I think that makes a ton of sense. Because in my view, the identity is an operating system. It's the most personal part of your system, and it functions on its own language that you've built up through your own experience. Like every moment you've ever had, every piece of information you've taken in has formed you, which is that self, to the degree that you've taken it in, and that's where the honesty comes in. But yeah, you kind of create this operating system, and then it's hard to interact with static forms of other people's work because it's hard to slide it across in a certain sense, carrying the concept, not changing the labels to your own language. And so I think that a lot of what we're talking about is really the personal nature of awareness and how to enact a truth process on that, which I think is a lot of what you were saying, which is you break it into your own language. Me and Ken talked about that in the last chat, because you have a structure, and actually, interestingly, you can become your own model, which is one of the reasons why I want to be super open to talking in any label and not stick to mine the whole time, because a lot of the times, especially in academics, people actually become their own model of the world, and that is another trap, and that can happen at any level. So it's almost like you're constantly fighting, or your mind is trying to make a simpler version of itself to run automatically. And the truth-seeking process is not allowing that automatic cruise control system to dictate where you will look for information.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, I might kind of try to tie those two things together and put them in the framework of kind of the Christian / psychological philosophical model, which is more my language, and this goes back to the base camp, right? You mentioned base camp. This is base camp of Mount Sophia, is that ability to extract your sense of self from the models you hold of the world. Like, to the degree that that any piece of your construct of reality is held in check, that's reified against any incoming data stream or perspective or whatever that can change it, you lose that grasp with reality. And thus you become like your mind begins running a simulation because it's different from reality itself, but you're stuck in that simulation because you placed your identity there.
Yeah, so I think, we talked a little bit about the mental structure before, and that's kind of, there's layers to that, where there's kind of your total truth. If you had actually integrated every part of yourself, that would actually match reality fairly well. But we've all built some version, some model of ourself that isn't quite that. And the tension between our identities, or identity fragments, is kind of the overlapping differences between the truth and the versions of us that have, different forms in the mental structure. And what's interesting to me is the layers of the mind. You have, your kind of standard state, and then you have the subconscious, which are the fragmented identities that are kind of playing that role. And then underneath that, the unconscious itself. And I think that's why so much therapy, internal family systems anyway, focuses on integrating those personalities so that you can go deeper and deeper. And there's a wholeness that's achieved through kind of containing the whole self.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wonder what so I know you guys have kind of went through and like in a really detailed way, kind of described and picked apart your guys' belief systems.
Yes, please. All right.
And so that's I don't want to, retread old ground, but one thing that I got from watching your guys' last video, well, first of all, it's very, very difficult to fully understand what we're talking about. When I speak, like 90% of what I say, I'm like, that doesn't really convey what I'm trying to convey. Like, especially in this space, it's very, very, very difficult.
And then we've got to hear it and.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that I was thinking about when I was watching your guys' last video is that we use a lot of these terms that kind of are doing a lot more work than they should be, because you're bringing in a whole bunch of baggage when you're using these terms, such as like self, reality, consciousness. And so one of the main takeaways from that was that finding a way to make these terms do less work, and so you can use a term that like self, and the other person know, oh, do you mean like your deep self that's like in some other realm that's like projecting reality, or do you mean like your self like sitting in the chair? Like there's just a lot of these sorts of like vague terms that are just very overloaded. And so one of the easiest, not solutions, but at least part that would help, is I like to use this distinction between, like, if I'm saying self or reality, that's what we are experiencing right now. Like I'm Shane, that's myself right here. And if you want to talk about something deeper, you can say things like, you can make whatever term you want, but I like the word like super self, super reality, just super whatever. I think it's a good way to kind of break down the distinction. A lot of times when I'm listening to these sorts of things, it's like, are you talking about, like, it's just, you're chasing the point of a person saying by trying to, like, oh, he's talking about this, oh, he's talking about that, and then the other person's already 10 words further down into their point that they're trying to make. So I don't know if that's a fruitful way to approach this, but that's one of the things that I noticed, at least.
For sure. I think that's really important to clarify. And just to kind of speak to how I've been portraying that so far anyway, is, I'm trying to view the mind as a system, and the different processors are actually different places we can sit in our mind and look at the other ones from there. So it gets quite complicated to get into the details there, but essentially there's layers and modes to the mind. And that's me trying to kind of pull apart the different functions and bring that to a place where it's something that awareness can understand about its own ability to navigate in that structure. And space and time for me help, because it allows me to physicalize or visualize what I'm talking about when I compare it to the universe, which is, we can all point at and understand the same way a little more.
Yeah, like universe is another interesting one, because just the word itself, universe, is kind of like a totalizing concept, all-encompassing idea. But when I tend to think of space. So I don't know, how do you define the word universe? What are you thinking of? Are you thinking of everything, like beyond what we can consciously experience?
It sounded like Ken, you wanted to jump there. I don't want to.
Well, yeah, can I interject something that may be a helpful tool here? Before I would love to hear your answer to that question, sure, Steve, but something that may be worthwhile here would be to talk about the relative words in relative position to each other, because you have this problem, and you're very correct, I think, that we're using words that rest under, that many other words rest upon higher up in, let's say the structure of words. And as you get lower down in the structure to more foundational words, as it were, more of everything about what we understand through words rests upon that word. So this is, I think, one of the really interesting functions of language is you get this trickle down aspect of where like you can use a word and you could spend 10 minutes explaining what you mean by that word and not even do it very much justice. And so I very much appreciate what you're saying. I'm wondering, and maybe you can speak with to this, Steve, as you answer, how we address this. Like I appreciate you defining your words, but in terms of if we're going to communicate to people in a broader audience, shall we say, some of these ideas that we're trying to work with, how do we find a balance between using words that have so much resting on them and we mean something very specific by, but are equivocated in culture in a very kind of trivial kind of meaning fashion. So that's kind of maybe a backdrop a little bit to this conversation of what I'm interested in here, because I think this is a really important point.
Sure. Yeah, there's so many things there. One of the challenges is these aren't normal topics. We're actually talking about specifically the things that are hard to talk about with words. And as part of that, we kind of, at least part of my journey to be able to understand this was understanding whole forms, not just parts, which I think the world has a relatively, shared understanding of how parts function, but how whole forms and parts interact with each other. And then also how, I'll call it time, but the dynamic, the whole that contains the whole, there's kind of a nesting, and there's two dimensions at which people aren't used to thinking about. So it's very, very difficult to speak to. Now I want to give kind of my modeled answer to Shane, kind of show you how I attempt to do that, because I think kind of explaining why it's difficult to say, and then an example might be a way of helping. So you asked what I thought of the universe, what I think that is. And I think on some level, that's oneness. So it just is. But as soon as you try and break it into parts, you have reality and possibility. So reality is what is, structurally where things are. Okay, space. I think of space as a sort of marbles in a certain structure. So it's very physical, it's very understandable in that sense. Now, it's also space-time, of course, and that is the motion within space. So here you might take our marbles and put them in the ocean. And if you every water droplet is essentially a marble, right? But let's just keep the marbles, fill the whole ocean with marbles. You have space or matter as the marbles, and the water and the motion of the water, because it's a non-solid form, is space-time, is the local motion that's moving all the particles. That's relatively easy to understand compared to the next layer, which is time. And in my model, that would be the air above the water. And the reason for that is because as the water moves, the air also moves. But that is a very hard thing to wrap your head around, because we don't normally think of air as nothing. That is the problem. There is no nothing. So as a wave crests and comes up, the air is actually doing the opposite motion and reducing its area relative and then increasing it in the fall of the wave. And so time is the hidden dimension, the thing on the other side of the structure of space-time, the thing that contains and holds it. So if you can think of space-time as having a form, it's kind of suspended, but that suspension is time. And I believe what that is the whole motion, matter, everything in its current state and its momentum from the previous state, non-locally affecting every part. And that's why I say interpenetration, because it's not just interconnected like an ocean and marbles would be, it's actually penetrated through this self-suspension. If you're familiar with nuclear fusion and what they have to do, they have to try and suspend the plasma in this tomahawk and try and make it not hit the walls. basically they're suspending energy in space, and that's kind of a similar way. So, understanding what I'm saying.
Yeah, I really like your concept of space-time. That's very interesting. Like when you're saying that, like it felt very like natural for me to think of that. So it's interesting because I wouldn't put it the same way, but I wonder if there's some sort of like, you know, continuity between the way that we think about these things. What about you, Ken? What do you think to answer the what is the universe question? Like what are we talking about?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that immediately comes up for me to kind of address and then say that's not exactly what I mean is mechanical system. I think there is an aspect of, I mean, there's certainly the aspect that we understand as a mechanical system. I think that's a lower level of reality than what I mean when I say the universe. When I
Wait, sorry. So you're saying you think the universe is, you think in terms of like a mechanical system is lower level than what you're describing for universe, or the other way around? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, no, I think the mechanical aspect of the universe, right? The fact that there is a world and a sun, solar systems, planets, all that stuff. I think that's all real, but and very much. Okay, maybe I should start by saying I see the universe. When I say the word universe, I'm thinking of the whole of everything that exists, and and these words are hard. So I would connect that to the word God.
Okay, yeah.
Very directly.
I think I understand there, Ken. You're basically saying the reason you're not a materialist is because you view the material physical world as a whole, but contained within a larger whole.
Yeah, exactly. So what I was struggling with there is to go into kind of dynamic levels of reality. And I think there's this nestedness of reality where there's like the great field of nothingness. When I would say that's kind of absolute nothingness is kind of that singularity would be what Steve would say, that point where all things.
There's a term for that I think is good. It's called like true darkness or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's a old term from like magic.
Cool.
But yeah, sorry. Just reminded me. I happen to have the book like right by me. So.
Nice. Yeah. Some words that I would use would be that's a good one. Matt Meister Eckhart talked about it in terms of the Godhead and the desert of God, or the ground of God, the ground of being. And from a Christian perspective, this is the aspect of God that is one. And the next level of reality down is the manifestation of the Trinity, which is the one becoming multiple. And from that multiplicity springs all of the universe insofar as we can perceive it.
And what we had said in our previous talk, Ken, there was basically that is moving from a state of singularity to the universe is the separation of kind of one form into three.
So I'll stop there because, I mean, again, I have to stop somewhere. So
yeah, and yeah, each of any of these could just, you know, take off, which is a whole rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting too. We're all raised Christians, so I think we all have like a similar, I mean, I have a little bit different than you guys, but
yeah, maybe
similar understanding.
Could you share your story with us a little bit? We kind of skipped that part.
Oh yeah, sure. So mine's a little different. I think you guys both said you're Protestants. Okay, so I was raised in like a Mormon family, which is very different. but it's a lot of people, I've been surprised a lot of people don't realize that it's like a very, very, very Jesus centric religion. A lot of people tend to think of it as like, oh, it's just its own thing, but it's like, no, it's called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But my story is, goes a few different strange directions, because when I was probably around like 13 or 14, I was like, I just don't believe like any of this that they're starting to tell me. I was kind of given like a kind of a position, within everything. Like the name of it is like, I can't remember actually the exact name of it, but there's these different like groups of, if you're 12 to 14, you're a part of this group. And so I was, made the leader of my age group. And I remember just thinking like, why are they giving this to me? I'm like, I didn't think of myself as like super devout, but I was like, all right, let me take this. And like, I just kind of like really started to think like, all right, if I'm being given this, like, you're leading everyone this age, like, I got to really like step into this role. And during that process, like, I've just kind of like had to come to terms with the fact that I didn't believe like pretty much any of everything if I actually like questioned it. It was kind of like a, you go with your family sort of thing. So I kind of went through like a traditional like just pendulum swinging back the other way. Like, I feel like I was lied to for my entire childhood. So like I kind of like went the very opposite way. I got super into like, oh, the world's just material, like it's just the Big Bang happened, there's the huge universe, there's, if there's going to be a really unlikely event, there's a really big field of things happening all the time for very unlikely events to happen. So it doesn't mean there's a God if all of this exists. Like, I found a lot of different ways to kind of, I don't know, rationalize all of my beliefs, because you don't realize how many things are just taken for granted that you believe, especially when you're coming from like a very religious household like we were. And this might be wrong, and sorry if this is, but it's been my impression that Mormons are very devout in comparison to a lot of other Christian sects. Like, we would, like, you go to seminary before school, you have multiple weeknight things, you have like 3 or 4 hours of church every Sunday, and like everyone just like, it's just a community. Like, Mormons work together, they form businesses together. It's just like a super not exclusive, but like I don't, what I'm trying to say. But anyways, so
yeah, there's a quick aside. I have a model of that where it's like I feel like the Mormons kind of took like the Puritan model of the world and like updated it and actually made it workable for like to work in the modern world and be dynamic. But anyway,
there's definitely something there. And as I got later into my life, I've like very much softened my view back towards the Mormon church. Like, I hated it when I was 16, 17. I was just like, I feel like I got duped. Like, there's a great, Eric Weinstein had a really great quote about this. He says something about like what people find intolerable, and that's kind of your personality. And he listed a bunch of things. I don't remember what they were, but the one that he listed that I was like, that's me, is people who just hate being tricked. I hate being lied to, and I just absolutely despise like being made a fool of. Like, I'm good enough at making myself a fool. I don't need someone else to do it for me. So I basically just completely, I hate all spirituality. It's all fake. And then I don't know when exactly I started to kind of edge back towards like just healing from that trauma, I guess, in a way. I guess you could kind of conceptualize it that way. I don't think I would, typically think of it that way at the time. I wouldn't think of like, oh, I'm healing or whatever. But as I got less and less bothered by like my history and, all my families and stuff still like Mormon and whatever, once all the family rifts and all these things happen, like it kind of like recentered me. And so now I'm just kind of like, I don't have any real, very like firmly held beliefs. I have a few that I would probably say like are like 95% I think are true. But it's, overall I tend to put myself in this like I don't know much sort of category. But when I first really started to kind of get into like thinking more deeply about this was when I started to do my math undergrad. Because there's I don't know how much math you guys have taken, but there's a point where you stop like doing math in terms of like, oh, what's the answer? Like, and you start to like thinking like almost like a systemic like conceptualization of math concepts, and you start proving things, and you start talking about things like, abstract algebra and these like groups and general ideas about operations, acting on objects, functions, and all these sorts of things. And a lot of that stuff really is what kind of started to make me like just overlay these things I was learning about and just kind of like play around with these ideas. I think probably one of like the most, just to give one concrete example, I think one of the most like things that fulfilled this sort of thinking the most was when I started to take elliptical geometry, and it's like a non-Euclidean geometry. There's hyperbolic geometry and ecliptic geometry. So there's this really interesting like geometrical system that I looked at, and I was like, that looks like I can just see how that reflects like the physical world. And so it's I wish I could just like, I mean I could, but I don't want to go there. But there's this thing called you guys heard of chaos theory, I'm assuming, just like that phrase. The guy who came up with that was this guy named Poincaré, or I don't know how to pronounce his name exactly, so sorry if I completely butchered that. But basically he came up with this like concept of like, if you're looking at any straight lines, and we think of straight lines and we think of like the geometric axioms regarding straight lines that such as like, if you have two straight lines, then like basically they'll go forever, they'll never touch, like these sorts of ideas. And there's only one set, like if you have this line and a point right here, and there's what line is perpendicular to this line and passes through this point. In our normal way of geometry, we say, oh, there's only one line, it's just that line that's right there, it passes to that point and is parallel with this line, with this first line. When you think of, and when you go to Euclidean non-Euclidean geometry, there's actually an infinite number of lines that are parallel, because lines themselves are curves. So this I really should show a picture. This would make a whole lot more sense. But well. So if you look up the Poincaré disk model, you'll see how there are all of these. It gives you an example, just kind of a visual demonstration of all of the lines that are perpendicular or parallel to this line. There's just an infinite number of them. And so what you have is this like idea that if you have two objects in space and you sent them out just, directly parallel, but you had them go. In like normal geometry, they would just stay parallel forever. But in this sort of geometry, as they went further, they would actually spread apart. Even though they're perfectly straight, even though they're perfectly parallel, if you give them enough time, they would just
because the universe is expanding?
Well, no, it's part of this. Maybe that's kind of part of the mechanic, like maybe underneath this is kind of where the mechanics are. I don't think so. It's more of a metaphor in a way, but you can see how it's basically models the expanding universe if you look at it. I don't want to like say, oh, that's what it is, because I haven't studied like that stuff super deeply.
Okay.
So I don't
Okay.
want to
Sure.
say it is, but if you look in the chat, you can see that all of those lines would be considered parallel, and that if you were to, and so that circle is everything. That circle is infinitely large, essentially. So any straight line that exists in this universe is actually a curve. And it's not just any curve, it's a curve where the line inside of the circle, where it hits the outer circle, makes a right angle. So if you look at any of those curves on there, so what you have with this is this geometric system is like one-to-one like our normal geometry system that we have. And so you can basically have like this completely different functioning geometry that like is as good as what we use and what we think of as geometry. And all these lines, like there's no such thing as a straight line, they're all curves. And you have, but it's like a complete geometric system that can be used to prove any assertion that geometry can prove, that normal geometry can prove. So seeing this like different, like just kind of recognizing that you can have this, all of our ideas of like things like as simple as like lines and points and stuff, like we take that stuff to mean like we're, oh, this is kind of like, you know, the fair model of how to represent things. And you realize there's actually a completely different model that's as like it's a like provably exactly as like truthful as normal geometry is, but it works in a completely different way from how we think. It has, you know, you have all these things like unit, like ways to measure things, all of the components of geometry. So that was one of the first things that I kind of started to like really like take and like internalize and start to like make me really kind of question like a purely scientific understanding of how things work, you know, because I would probably have said like, oh, I'm just purely materialism, you know, in terms of like everything is just functions, like everything is just built out of atoms and subatomic particles, and that's just the way it is, and we think things are special because evolution made that a strategy that is useful for us to, you know, continue our species. I would think of things in those terms. But this is one of the first things that I saw that really kind of made me start to like reevaluate how certain I was about pretty much everything. And so from there, I kind of started to go through, I mean, I went through a number of different ways of thinking about what I thought reality was, things that are like, you know, I was really like things I would like write down and like try to really create a really complex understanding of, to like things that would be like, oh, wouldn't that be crazy if like the world, you know, I kind of like have no idea. So I've kind of like really explored ideas of like esoteric knowledge and magic, and those being like real and like not crazy. And like, and I've also gone through like more of like a, I don't know, like a Thomas Campbell or Bernardo Kastrup conception, where it's like, you know, like all of this is just something that our brains are creating, like not our brains, but our like deeper super self-consciousness that we have, like it's just creating all of this, and that, you know, it's not really representative of reality, and like, you know, a lot of those sorts of things. And so I've jumped around to a bunch of different things. But right now, I would probably describe what I think as, I mean, it's like a whole story. It's not a.
Let's jump into that part a little later, because I think there's a lot of that you touched on there that we can talk about forever. And One thing
Yeah,
really
sorry to
quick.
rant, my bad.
Oh, no, no
No,
worries.
that was
That was
perfect.
great.
Thank you for sharing your story. That was beautiful.
Mhm. One of the things that I wanted to speak to with the lines running in parallel forever versus being curved. Well, if there was a singularity, if it all came from one place, really it has to be curved, because ultimately you wouldn't think things would never interact. Certain things would never interact. And so I think when you have a conception of things all starting without position, it really, there's a fundamental relativity to things. There isn't an absoluteness in which you could go straight. Directionality itself has to be based on
I
other
think so
things.
too.
And then to speak to your more broader point there, I think you were talking really about the tools that we use, these conceptions, these reference frames that we have in our minds actually dictate the way in which we can process any information. So if you only have kind of the standard geometry picture in your mind, you can't do hyperbolic conceptions. And when you learn them, it's this crazy change of your what it is like to be your whole experience, because and that is the nature of integration. You've now integrated a tool, a way in which you noticed some part of the world working, and that's changed your own universe. So that's that the way that you're relating to the universe is changed based on how accurate your model is of it. And you really walked us through how some of the tools of math and science, there's many, and Ken has many in Christianity as well, but whatever tool you're using actually begins your reference frame, but also contains your reference frame. And so I think a lot of that, when you talk about tools, you're talking about the capacity we have to use these different processors of the mind to integrate. And I also found through learning physics and understanding a lot of Einstein's work around general and special relativity, that the way I viewed the world totally changed. Like that's how when I looked at the lakes moving, at the waves, I realized the air is moving too, because I realized why everything has an opposite and equal reaction. In a sense, it became physical and real to me.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Forgot what I was going to say. So you go ahead.
One of the things that, so I don't have nearly the kind of, it's funny, I work in the science field in the sense that I do medicine, but I don't know that medicine, the actual practice of clinical medicine involves a lot more of interpersonal relations than it does scientific knowledge. Kind of getting to the point that you're the person who's in the room talking to the people takes science, but much less math. But I was thinking about how you're talking about the visualization shift. Quantum physics did this for me, of quantum physics, and then also mystical experience. The shift of seeing, like you're saying, that I think the metaphor of the lake and the water above it is a really good one, because you have to visualize everything as just a field of energy in order to really get the sense of that. And I'll often try and move to the space in my sense of myself in meditation, where it is as if I am a point of light in a matrix space of energy particles, essentially. So there's go ahead.
Just a question, like, so I kind of get this feeling that both Steve and I kind of come with from this, I don't know, I don't want to speak too much. I almost just say I kind of come from this like perspective of like slightly idealism, like at least it incorporates a whole ton of it. Do you think that it's more physical than that sort of mindset? I'm trying to understand your.
So let me see if I understand what you mean by idealism. In terms of as if the reality experienced by the self is mostly a projection that the self is creating. Is that what you're?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay. As opposed to a nominalism, or sorry, an empiricism where everything is happening to you.
I don't quite get that
Oh, okay. No worries. No worries.
connection
That's fine.
back there, but
Basically, that consciousness is more fundamental than matter. It's kind of
yeah,
the order in which material and awareness relate.
yeah, that's a really good way to describe what I think too.
Yeah. So I have kind of a blending of them actually. I think it's both and. I think they're interpenetrating fully. So I think that reality is not objective and subjective. I think it's transjective. I think that what we are is, and again, this is the weirdness of all of this stuff where you have to say something and then say the opposite in order to actually try to get at what you're saying, which is something above that, which is that everything that exists is contained within me, but also I am contained and constrained by everything that exists outside of me.
Which is another way of saying oneness, but you're identifying the parts within oneness, because whenever you're talking about yourself, you kind of have to do that.
Right, because everything I ever interact with in the space of my experience of a self as much as I can experience myself as a self, is a function of, as far as I can tell, is a function of data intake into this interface. It's not, it is disingenuous for me to assume anything else. And therefore, necessarily, almost everything is happening to me. But it's also the case that the way in which I orient towards reality seems to be able to shift my experience in really important ways. Therefore, because everything I ever experience is actually internal of this interface, and I can change external, then maybe it's also the case that everything external that I think is external is actually a projection of the self. So I think it's a really potentially important point to say that you actually have to kind of radically accept both idealism and empiricism, or the inverse, where consciousness is above matter but also below.
That's very interesting. Does it feel like
oh, sorry,
a contradiction in your head, or because when you describe it, it comes across as a contradiction? But I know what the futility of trying to describe something like that is like. So have you resolved the contradiction in your head with some sort of intuitive sense of it, or is it something that you're still kind of trying to work through?
So maybe I'll try to come at it from a different angle, because it's like one of those strange places that you can't know it until you've been there without having heard it. And it's something like the path out of the sense of self as being the subject. So Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" must be transcended, and that "I think, therefore I am" kind of presupposes that the deepest sense of self that you can manage is the ground of being. And this is kind of where you end up with postmodernism and Sartre's man's existence and its essence. Sorry, we don't need to go all that down that road, but to move behind that is to say that it's not even my subjective experience of self that needs to be maintained in any way. I'm going to dive into the abyss of meaninglessness that underlies my life and release any sense of control of the fact that I have a self even, and allow for it to be possible that this is all totally meaningless in any way. And in so doing, you transcend the self as the subject of reality. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Well, I wouldn't say that I fully get what you're saying, but I definitely like feel what you're saying. Yeah, that's interesting.
Steve might do a better job of.
Well, I think the nature of the paradox, sort of as the pure apparent paradox, there is, it's specifically why quantum mechanics helped you, because quantum mechanics is superposition. So it appears as a paradox until you have a deeper understanding, until you go to another dimension and realize they're not actually the exact same thing that's being contradicted. And so, Ken, when you were speaking, I was thinking, because I actually would share Ken's frame there, in that I don't think that I'm not an idealist. I believe that really the only thing that idealism and materialism don't understand is each other. And it's really wrapped. Essentially, what reality is a time loop. And yeah, it gets back to reality and possibility. But sorry, I want to go back to what Ken was saying, because that's going to be another aside there if I go down that route.
Yeah, I feel like we need like some sort of thing that like keeps track of what we're saying. We bring up a point, it just puts a little bullet point so we can just refer back to it.
Afterward, maybe we should watch through the video and like make points, and then we can just like make a video about one subject at some point.
Sure. Well, just to speak to what you were just to speak to what you were saying there, Ken, with the integration of it all. I think the reason why I don't believe idealism is true is because of what we were saying before, where when you integrate a new understanding of reality, it appears to change to you totally. And so in that frame, I believe that, now you could argue that the processors that are changing are lower than consciousness, which I actually believe in a quantum way. So, the digital processor is the most zoomed in level of reality, and it's very precise for that reason, but it also misses the bigger picture. And when you step back from thinking to feeling, you're actually moving back, you're getting less precise, but much more rapid and much more holistic. And then as you step back from feeling even further to awareness itself, pattern recognition, that's another layer back. So the layers of reality are contained within these data types, and awareness is actually on both sides. And that's time containing space.
Oh, that's a cool visual. Oh, I like that. Yeah, I'm picturing like what's those like particle accelerator donut things that they use?
Yep.
Yeah, it's like that.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the visual, not actually like that in terms of the mechanics of the thing, but the visual that I'm seeing.
Yeah, so when I say reality is a time loop, that's what I mean. I mean that awareness is on both sides of it. And that's how we as consciousness are looking back at God, which is reality, time unfolding into us. So it is like a face inside the head kind of idea, which again, once I integrated that into my own process, really changed the way it was like, what it was like to be me. And so that's part of why it was so convincing. It's because when you have some of these experiences, it's so fundamentally more true than words. And that is what drives these huge changes, because, in a certain sense, words can't really cause you to change your frame that exists underneath words. They can kind of tease you to go in that direction, but it is the experiences that will do it.
One thing to say there is like, just to put the Christian frame on this, because it sounds really abstract, but this is the Christian frame, that what human beings are at the core of them is God himself, right? Now, it always has to be couched in really careful language, which is that the way you perceive yourself is not God, right? So your self-consciousness is absolutely not God. That's actually where you get it all wrong. That's the problem. But underneath that is the image of God himself. Your temple is the Holy Spirit. You are one with God, all these kinds of ideas. So yeah, it is. It's like the face within the face and endless mirrors.
Yeah, I think you were talking on Twitter a little bit about that, about, God as a being versus God as nature or time. I don't know how else you would phrase that, but God is the path out of self-conception rather than another being you exist in relation to within self-conception. And that is really the challenge of society right now, in my view, is understanding the difference between those through understanding how these other processors, which we have no education around, how they function and how they make us human, because we're not computers. We have a computer in us, but we're not just that. And in a sense, we've fallen into our label maker, is the way that I say it. There are a lot of people who are running around thinking that they are essentially a computer and are operating as one. And it's not possible to feel, shouldn't say it that strongly, that's not, the ideal self doesn't exist on that plane, right? The ideal self exists back 2 levels. So your normal conscious state is at the thinking processor, and you move back to feeling, that's your subconscious, and awareness, you're moving back into the unconscious. And that's kind of the wholeness that I think the world really needs to move towards. And we need whole schools of education to achieve this ultimately, because we're spending all of our time educating people on the weakest and most isolated of the 3 processors, which is kind of crazy if you understand the system and the potential that could be unlocked.
Are you familiar with Thomas Campbell?
Yes. Yeah. It's been a while since I've seen his work, but
It reminds me a lot of how he talks about the intuitive like mode of thinking and feeling and the logical, and he errs on this like side that the intuitive is like way more powerful than the logical is. And he thinks that fundamentally what we're doing is essentially creating probability distributions and sampling from them in our intuitive thinking. So when we,
yes.
so he thinks that, well, his views are, at least from out without having read his whole like theory of everything, My Big Toe trilogy that he has, like just from listening to him talk is the extent of how I've been exposed to him. But he tends to think that reality renders itself at the level of detail necessary. And so we create these cheap computations to do complex things. And because that's the level of closeness that we're at, he gives us an example of throwing a baseball, and how if you think about a baseball and you like actually were to throw it, and you can like, and you think about this like purely physically, you can think like, oh, the air molecules are going to be coming, the thread on the baseball is going to be is going to be going through the air and hitting the air in different ways from different normal vectors against the surface of the ball. Like you can think of it in terms of all these things. And if you were to build a really complicated machine and measure all of that, you would see all of those things happen. But when we throw a ball, it goes into our intuitive sense, and then and he thinks that kind of projects reality, and that is just like this, like essentially like there's, say in this example, you would have like a really, really high peak on this probability distribution. And so like you'd be, likely pulling from something that makes sense around physics and without doing all of the computations of physics. And I found that to be a really fascinating way to think about things. And there's an extent that I believe that, but then I have things that contradict that I think. So I don't know what I believe.
Yeah, perfect. I don't either. I try not to believe anything, actually. So if I can run with that model a little bit, because I think I see where that model can go. You have the levels of reality at which it discloses itself to you. And that has something to do with the amount of awareness you're able to spend in a focus, right? So if I'm going to do math, say, or I'm going to have this conversation, I'm going to minimize distractions as much as I can so that my processing capability is here. And in my thinking processor, like you said, it's very high resolution, but because it's so high resolution, it requires a great deal of energy to pay attention at that level. And the farther and farther I break reality apart and move down and out, it's like swimming out, my ability, both the power of my attention in that space and the breadth of it gets diminished because it's moving away from the actual source of the attention itself, which is the core of awareness. And so that's all wonderful and good, but if I'm in a moment where there's a lot of dynamics happening, the baseball's coming at my face, I don't have anything like the ability to, like, I somehow intuitively know that I don't have the ability to do that. So my brain won't even let me try to go to that level. I just back up to a point of where I'm roughly analyzing reality, but it actually worked.
Right.
And if you do this in a situation, maybe like a baseball being thrown at your face, when there's like this, there's no time to think, this is kind of how you get into flow states where you just have pure awareness, because when pure awareness is the processor, you're fully dynamic. Your entire system is dynamic. And so, like, one of the ways I might try to talk about the ideal experience of being a human being and to be actually a fully real human being is that all the processes are realizing, and I use that word very intentionally, both making real and recognizing the world around you in all their abilities. Because if you're fully in awareness, it's like all of those systems can run and do their thing because they're not trying to hold anything. I'm not trying to actually know a thing about reality. Just to know it, I have to have it. And so as long as I'm not trying to have anything, I'm not spending any of my awareness way out there. It's all back in here and it's just moving.
Interesting. Yeah, I 100% agree with that, like, idea of when you are operating on intuition, it feels like you're operating at a higher level, I think. Like, even with, and this might be contradictory, but even with something like programming, for example, which I do for, I do that every day. Like, when I get into a good flow state, like, I'm not even thinking. I'm just kind of like there, and I'm just allowing my fingers to do things. An even better example would be playing music. Do either of you guys play an instrument?
I don't. I have no musical talent whatsoever.
No.
Unfortunately.
I do. I play guitar a little bit, but I'm not excellent by any means.
So that's, I'm okay. I'm not like really great or anything, but I've jammed, in bands and stuff, and like played, with either piano, guitar, bass, drums. I've kind of jack of all trades, but not very good jack of all trades. But I've played in bands before, and like, I can play something kind of cool when I'm just like sitting down and grabbing guitar. But like, when I'm in the moment, I'm like hearing the music. It's very, like, lots of stuff that we would play would be kind of complex, like some, like, jazzy stuff, for example, or kind of like more progressive rock stuff. And like, you're just able to like kind of make up stuff on the fly, and all of that is very complex. Like, you're thinking in terms of like you're not thinking in terms of scales or anything, and you like feel that, but it's not a like kickboxing where it's just physical, and you think that, oh, that's really intuition because you're like using, like, you're really you're going down into like your deep old reptile brain to do that sort of stuff. But even for like intellectually demanding tasks, you can still get on the intuitive side, which is very strange because it doesn't make all these mistakes, and it's doing all these really complex things that you would like normally have to be like and like really like focus and like think about. So that's an interesting dynamic there I haven't thought about before.
This is so great, because this is really what I was saying when I say digital and analog information. So to go back to my lake metaphor, in a sense, we touched on this last time, but insight is a process that runs on knowledge. And so normally when you're thinking, you're being the marbles and you're placing them and you're building something one marble at a time. And that's very linear process of the thinking. But the ocean itself, if you imagine taking all the marbles in the ocean and removing them, but not allowing the water to collapse. So all of the negative space where the marbles were is still networked throughout the ocean. That is a whole that's driving the parts that I've taken out. So in that model, the marbles are concepts, words that have a relation to each other. That's digital. And when you take them away, the logos, the ocean that is sitting there with the marble gaps, that's the whole form of intuition. And that is why you can do things lightning quick, because you have a massive network that is actually based on the negative space of your knowledge.
That makes sense. That's a very interesting way to think about it. It's almost like you change the structure, because when I think of thinking, I think in terms of like a graph or like a tree, like a map graph. Yeah, flow chart, this UML diagram or something like that. I think but just this idea of like nodes, edges, connections, and stuff like that. So it seems like what we're kind of getting at is that the intuition almost incorporates what the very conscious mind, like your conscious mind constructs these things slowly, very carefully, builds them into into a way that you now I get it. For instance, when you're first reading a book, you it doesn't stick, but the second time you read through it, each word flows really easily in. So it's it basically kind of they share information and share structure. It kind of builds the structure. So let's pretend that pretend, but this is what most people think is that it's just purely in your brain, right? All of these things that we're talking about are just aspects of our neurons connecting and stuff like that. So that would imply that this slow thinking, is it because when you're doing all these kind of on the fly things, you're operating in a different part of your brain. So would the idea be that there's a double, almost you learn here and it recreates the connection somewhere else? I'm curious as to what the materialistic viewpoint of that would be. Or I don't know enough about brain chemistry, but I know at least a little bit about some aspects of it from psychology and stuff. But
so this is a really nice kind of nested example of the thing we're actually talking about, where you just tried to bridge a connection to the materialistic viewpoint of reality, but immediately you've been flowing quite well talking about these different abstract levels of kind of how we relate and how this all relates to itself. But as soon as you try to make that connection to that level, it's whoa, holy crap, that is really high density data. That is really high density data about neurons and neuroscience. And first of all, I don't have the requisite study to have done that, because I would have had to spend my life doing that. But also, even then, I still don't really have any idea how it works. I can just say well, these are all the ways it interacts with each other, and this is the theory we have about how that makes all what we think is happening happen. And so it's you have to, and this is why it's not there's anything wrong with it. There's science is an amazing thing that is a tremendously powerful tool,
right?
But it's just not wise. Because wisdom is what happens when you can see the pattern from the top to the bottom.
Interesting.
Yes.
You think of wisdom as a continuity?
Yeah, that's kind of why I call it Mount Sophia, right? Because the one of the metaphor for the whole of this that we're talking about is the mountain of reality itself, and part of that is the knowing of reality. And And so like, yeah, on this bottom level, we have science and it's so high data, but here at the top we have, ideas like God and the Trinity. And if you look through those down, you can make sense of a lot of things, but it might not tell you very specific information. Like it will be very powerful in terms of how you relate to the reality, but your ability to say like, this is how much this weighs or this or that, it's not helpful to tell you that. This is part of why like people trying to take the story of the fall and the story of creation, the Bible, and explain it in a literal materialistic framework is just a devastating mistake, because you end up losing unbelievable data compression because you've tried to just make it a very specific frame space of reality.
Yeah, and you've like flattened all of like the metaphorical truth, all the information, like the subtext and all that sort of stuff when you try to map it directly to reality.
And yeah, I think why it's so difficult is because each of the processors has, each of the data types that we're talking about has a different method of coherence. So thoughts fit together a certain way, feelings fit together a certain way too, but it's very, very different. And also connecting your feelings and thoughts is another separate process that really takes place at the boundary. This is what's happening in this conversation right now. We're trying to connect thoughts and feelings, intuition and reason, and think about how they work through example, and it's difficult for various reasons, but that is the process of integration, is each processor understanding how the other one operates. That's getting to the whole system. That's kind of what meditation, the goal of meditation in my mind is the harmonious intertwining of these three processors to create a single reality that is whole. And that's kind of the map of where we're trying to go. And the difficulties along the way are when we're only able to look at some layer of reality from one or two of the processors. When you could do it with all three, you can integrate that level of reality and start working towards the next. And that's kind of overall coherence in that sense, is the coherence between the depth layers, whereas in an individual processor, the coherence is specified.
So I know this meeting's about to end in a second, but what have you, if you did and I missed it, I'm really sorry, but what are you defining as these processors? Like what are these three processors that you're saying?
Sure. Yeah. So what I mean by the three processors are thought, feeling, and awareness.
Okay. All right.
And another way of saying that is body, mind, and soul. And that connects more to the kind of religious view of it. Yeah, those are the same things, just misunderstood across time.
This is
Absolutely.
awesome.
Yeah, this is the most interesting topic of all topics by
Yeah.
far. Like,
It
is all topics.
Contains all topics. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't say this earlier because I didn't want to cut you off, but you, Ken, when you were talking about this kind of like the whole and like the like this kind of like duality between like this like infinite and the self-contained and those sorts of things, I posted something in the Twitter chat that is very interesting metaphorically to what you're describing. So it's something called a Riemann sphere. And so what's fascinating about a Riemann sphere is that what you have is you get an infinite plane, right?
Okay.
So just goes out in every direction as far as you can think. If you take a sphere, you put it above the plane, you can find any point on the plane, draw a line from it to the top of the sphere. It'll go, so if this is a plane and then the sphere is right here and you're drawing from over here, like you're drawing to the top, it'll pass through the sphere somewhere on the side and then go inside through the top, right? Like you can see that, I think, in the image, or maybe not in the specific image. Let me drop this one in better.
I think I get the idea of it, though. I see what you're saying.
But what's fascinating is that you can have the infinite field of that plane, and every point on that infinite field will map to exactly one place on that sphere. So you have the finite shape of the sphere basically just has a one-to-one mapping from every point on it to an infinite plane. So there's a connection there that this like idea of like infiniteness and finiteness is not as like they're kind of like you can swap between them, and you can basically do that for any dimension. Like you can do this same idea in like a just 2D, just a line, just a number line in a circle, or you can do it in like a hypersphere with like a hyperplane. So there's these, and it's just and the math still works the same way. So
oh,
sorry, go ahead.
Are you done there? I don't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, yeah, I'm done.
Okay, so I just wanted to say, like, I think this is a really good frame to try to conceptualize. And again, I haven't worked with this before, but this sounds like it could be a good frame to conceptualize the reason for being as human beings itself. Like when people ask, like, what's the point of this whole thing? Why are we even here in the first place? Is because we are, in a sense, the infinite experiencing itself through finiteness of itself.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that at all. That's a really good point.
Because in that sense, right, like you have the sphere, which is creating the infinite space in a sense, because the space is only existent in that it references the sphere. Because if you have an infinite plane, it doesn't exist at all unless it's referenced onto something. There's no, like, it might be an infinite plane, but there's like, it doesn't even matter until it's referenced off of something.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. Like you can't describe where you are on an infinite plane.
Yeah.
There's no sense of like, oh, I'm further this way if the plane is infinite. Like you can put a grid down, but the grid is just a label. It's not.
And this is exactly why you can't trust your own experience as being reliable on anything.
Because your experience is really like drawing a grid on that infinite plane and being like, oh, this is where I am. I'm here because this grid has been drawn that describes things, but take the grid away, like, or the grid doesn't, it's what's that phrase, the don't confuse the map for the land or something like that, where like if you focus on your perception of it and think that it's the thing, it limits your understanding of the thing because you already enclosed it in your idea.
That's original sin. Like you just told that is the knowledge of good and evil.
And there's also, becoming your own model, right? That is the whole problem. You're making an estimation of what is, and if you are going to replace what is with your estimation of what is, that is the forming of an identity, which is what an identity does is it's something that exists at the lower levels. It's something that exists in thought and feeling. What other than something you're insisting about feeling about yourself, thinking or feeling about yourself, that is what an identity is. And so when you do that, what you're doing is you're creating a boundary space of that awareness is allowed to roam in your own mental structure. So you're creating a hole, a space, and you're saying that's your playground, you play inside of it. To awareness. By the way, this is your subconscious and unconscious that is actually excluding that other information from you. And so your identity is a whole, but it is not the whole that contains all wholes. That is infinity, temporal infinity.
Interesting. One aspect of this metaphor that I don't know if it is important metaphorically, but it's part of like the technical aspect of it, is that this mapping maps from like the finite to the infinite. The infinite is a lower dimension, like lower dimensionality than the finite is. So basically the infinite that you're describing in the finite shape is that extra dimension. So yes. essentially so infinite two-dimensional plane, the verticality of that sphere, that basically is like the like that extra dimension is like the infinite. It's like essentially how it makes sense is that like you're adding in a dimension, you're staying finite, and it allows you to talk about basically like an entire infinite lower dimension. So when you create these like projections, you know, like you're gonna have like because I don't know if you guys think this, but like I think of higher dimension as more derived, less source. So I think of like going up in dimensionality is like creating more than like I think. I mean I haven't, you know, I'm not like really like literal about that, but like I tend to think of in terms of that. So like
I'm not quite sure how if not that I'm not trying to argue, I'm not sure if I follow you correctly. So as you're moving up in dimensions, is it a sense of define what you mean by created? I think that was the question where I'm.
And also when you say up, are you zooming in or out?
Well, I mean, zooming doesn't, it's hard to say because
Okay,
you
don't
know,
worry about it.
dimensions, like if you're, you know, if you're in 3 dimensions and you're going to go into the 4th dimension, like you're not
Is that
going
up or
along
down?
any of the existing axes. So it's hard to say, but
Okay.
like it's essentially my I mean, I don't really know if I have a point there. My point was that I don't know if there's something interesting in this metaphor about that dynamic.
Yeah, I had a sense of where you were going for a while, and it's not that I disagree with anything that you were saying. I just couldn't quite follow.
Yeah, and I'm not
very,
sure, honestly.
I'm very visual in how all this works for me. I look at a picture in my brain, and I kind of surf on new territory. So like you speak words to me, and I see them flow out into this and how they correspond. And so I do really well until I like, if I lose something a little bit, then I like get off the frequency almost, and it just gets a little bit confusing. So I apologize.
So maybe this will kind of, I don't, this again, all these are just off the cuff thoughts and not really, you know, I'm not
totally
it's my central philosophy. So
yeah,
the way
you're just rolling with
it. One way I was thinking about it is that if you're thinking in terms of getting higher dimensionality, and you think of like, oh, like we're getting more towards the source, we're going to be going higher dimensionality, that doesn't make any sense, because why is reality limited? Or like, you know, oh, I'm up at the 11th dimension. Like if you go down, there's a natural floor that kind of limits the extent, and we have a pretty good conception of our dimensions that we have. So one way that I've thought about things is that like the 0th dimension is where consciousness is. So it's like some realm that's not a dimension. It's almost like 0. It's like, you know, it's not a space. It's purely, I think it's purely information in some way. I don't know how to make that case exactly, but I think
yes, I understand now. I think, yeah, I see where you're going now.
Okay, yeah, sorry, it's very hard to describe.
Yeah, no, that's great actually, because that really cleared up for me too, and that is what I mean when I say time. I consider time the 0th dimension, and space-time the 4th, right, and wrapped around the 3 dimensions of space. So that's kind of how it's around space. That's the containment.
So, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to. I've never in my math. You know, you never actually talk about like 0 dimensionality. Like that's not really a concept I've ever come across. So I don't know. I don't know what my intuition's telling me.
Let me throw something at you on the math point there, because this is a fun one for me. So I think that 0 is misunderstood. I think that this idea of nothingness That doesn't make any sense. You can have no of one thing, but you can't have none of everything. And that's because people think in the same way you were saying with the parallel lines, that's an absolute framework. This is what people kind of have these days. And if you think math works that way, then it's absolute. It's a grid that has, built-in reference that's like solid. That's not how it works. And the result of that is that math is actually fundamentally a relative organization of change. Change, okay? And what zero is unity, sameness, everything being the same, everything being in one place or one time. That is zero. And on either side of zero, you have discrete and continuous representations of difference from zero. And that is a mathematical way of understanding how there ultimately is God and then him running away from himself. Because it is just a starting point and then relative formations around that. To go into biology, when a cell splits, it copies itself. A replication is it takes itself, and then any motion or matter is just a change in that self. So that's where I get to infinity. You have kind of overlapping circles, and all change is just one circle kind of flowing around the other one, which is effectively entropy. That is time coming into space.
Brachiostone or whatever those, or cardioid. That's a name what you reminded me of.
I don't know what that is.
The cardioid is it's a cool shape. It's like a important math shape, but it's basically like the circle kind of rotating around another circle and the shape that it draws, and it like appears.
Oh, you sent that
everywhere in nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you sent that image. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Interesting. So this is a really good example of what Ken was talking about earlier about like your knowledge. Well, actually, both of you guys talked about this. So sorry if I'm giving credit to the wrong person, but
that doesn't matter.
Yeah. Technically, we shouldn't care about that if we're being honest about any of this.
You guys can be like, oh yeah, in this meeting, I was talking about math, I was talking about being a Mormon, and I'd be, all right, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, if there was a way for me to identify myself in such a way that there was, that there like wasn't a way to track it back to any sense of an egoic self about me, that would be wonderful. But that doesn't seem to exist in the present world.
Human fragment 7,500,000.
Yeah.
Some weird coordinate.
Anyway, sorry, tangent. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's right. So this is a great example of what we were talking about earlier, where your reference frame gets in the way of understanding things that don't conform to it. So like when you're talking about zero and like these different ways of thinking about it, like I've thought about zero in like hundreds, like 100 different ways that are like really, all sorts of random things. And so like, I'm like not following at all what you're saying. I don't want to make that as pure, like it's like anything on you, but like, it's really interesting how like my brain is just like going like all these ideas like about things that I want to say while I was listening to you, and I'm like, it's like completely blinding me from like understanding like this other perspective on something like this. Like it's like if I was, I mean, I don't know what exactly Ken does, but you mentioned that you work with like patients. Like if I was just like doing this big metaphor about this like hypothetical patient interaction, and like my entire experience is informing me very differently.
You're interacting at the root level with a different operating system.
Yeah,
and that is the experience of doing so.
Yeah. So I don't want to like just, oh, here's my idea of zero, but
yeah, go with it.
I apologize if I like, because I'm trying to understand what you're describing, but I don't really have a good question to have.
Yeah, go with it. See if it comes, like talk about what you're something that came up, and then see if there's something comes out of that relating.
So my idea of zero, and I don't think this is super unique, but it's so there's a bunch of different zeros you can think of. You can think of 0 in the integers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can think of that 0. You can think of 0 as a real number 0, and real numbers are defined by these infinite sequences. So you have these like different ideas of 0 that are built out of these different constructions. Like, for example, all of the integers and stuff come out these like things called, well, actually I'm kind of wrong here, because 0, well, there's different ways of defining all the number systems and stuff, but 0 is actually one of your axioms. So I'm actually kind of wrong here, at least in this part of the example. But so 0 in terms of like a very structured math approach, there's a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about it regardless though. But one of the ones I find very interesting, which maybe there's might be way too much baggage to unpack it here, but essentially there's these ideas, abstract algebra is this really, I wish that that's what they taught instead of calculus in high school. I feel like one thing you'll find out is that like, oh, calculus that I learned is like I learned such a wrong version of calculus. It's almost like, not wrong, like it's like you're purely learning to use calculus versus like understanding calculus, which you like do in like a later class, like called a real analysis. But anyways, my point is that I think abstract algebra is a great thing for like high functioning high school kids. But my real point was that, sorry, I'm getting on tangents here.
It's easy to do when you have a very filled out frame. This is a very filled out frame for you, and it's so easy to jump off.
So I apologize if I'm ranting, but
you're fine.
Yeah,
you're fine.
It's very, very easy. So there's this idea of like abstract algebra. There's these things called groups and rings and fields, and there are these like structures in math that are like fundamental. They're kind of like I don't know if you want to like call them the atoms or whatever, but like they're like a really, really, really fundamental way of thinking about things like operations and stuff. But an analogy really doesn't serve them because they're kind of their own thing. But essentially, what you have is, I wish I could just have like a visualization of this. But you have things called cyclic groups and cyclic rings. And so what those are is, you guys know what modulus arithmetic is?
Not by that name.
Yeah, so it's like a clock. Like you add, like you have only so many minutes in a day. If you add minutes, it eventually just wraps back around. Like if you it's 11 p.m. and you add 2 hours, it's now, it's not 13 p.m. It's 1 a.m. right? So it now just arithmetic's the same concept. But there's sizes of these groups that are like, if you have a cyclic group, it doesn't matter what it is, it can be a number, it can be shapes, it can be whatever, you find out that all these different cyclic groups that are the same size are the same group essentially. And so you find that like, oh, like everything is, then the idea is isomorphism is the term. There's this isomorphism between like, oh, I'm going to do these like, I'm going to twist these knobs on this Rubik's cube, and then you're going to like, twisting and rearranging the Rubik's cube, but you can say that's actually isomorphic to this, just this many numbers and addition, and you can be like, they're the same thing, you can just map them from one to one. Anyways, there's, in all these ideas, there's this concept of 0, and it's kind of like just the, you have 0, if you add 0 to something, it doesn't change it. Like that's a function, that's like a very important, it's the identity, the additive identity is what it's called. I know this is a lot of baggage.
That's sameness. Yep.
Yeah. So, and then you have the multiplicative identity, which is 1, multiply there. But essentially you have this, these groups, and you have this like idea of 0 in this group. And as the groups get bigger and 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 bigger, you can, and you have two operations they're called rings on them. So like integers are rings that are addition and multiplication are the two operations. And essentially my point that I'm trying to make, a very long-winded point, is that when you start with these small groups, you can think of it as a circle. You can think of these operations moving around a circle. As you grow the group, it grows into a bigger circle. Eventually, the circle grows big enough that it's a straight line, and there's no getting around to it. So you have this infinite growing process of a circle that gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it becomes just a straight line, and there's no coming around to it anymore. It essentially flattens out once it gets big enough. But all throughout that process, you have kind of 0 being diametrically opposed to some element. And as you get infinitely big, you have 0 being like basically, it's kind of like the reverse of infinity in a way. So it's just this like way, I don't know, it's a long-winded argument, but like I have this like idea that like infinity and 0 are very similar because you can have like, they're very related. They're very like, so for example, do you guys know how subtraction is defined? Like if you think of subtraction, say, or division, sorry, yeah, division is defined. Like you think of like, oh, what's 8 divided by 2? Like what actually are you saying? You're saying, oh, break it into groups, but that's just semantically describing it. Like, what are you actually doing, like in terms of the operations? And what you're doing is, like, if you're doing 8 divided by 2, you're subtracting 2 a bunch of times and counting how many times you subtracted 2, and that's your answer. And so that suddenly gives you that understanding of that's what division is, suddenly makes you understand why you can't divide by 0. Because if you're doing, if you're doing like 1 divided by 0, you're doing 1 minus 0, and then you're back at 1, and then you're minus 0, you're back at 1, you're minus 0, and you're back at 1. So a lot of people kind of, especially in later math, they'll kind of say, oh, 1 over 0 or anything over 0. You can just think of it as infinity. So there's this like interesting relationship between infinity and 0. And so I think of as like the inverse, because like you can think of 1 over 0 as being infinity, and then 0 over 1 is just 0. So there's this inverse relationship between infinity and 0. And that's the general way that I think of 0, at least.
I think you basically
10 minutes
said
later,
exactly
sorry
the
about
same.
that.
No, I think you said exactly the same thing that Steve did, and you just put a lot more complexity into the thing, which is brilliant, because you have like this is your frame. So like that was really cool, because essentially it was just like Steve was over here on the mountain and you were over here on the mountain, and Steve was like, hey, how about this? And he got to here and you were like, I have no idea, so let me feel around. And then you were like, oh yeah, here we are.
Yeah,
interesting. So you work as a good like middle ground for translating, I guess, or connecting these ideas, because yeah, I mean, sorry, I feel like I was like super ranting there, but.
That was fine. That's great.
Yeah, I think just to speak to that, like 0 and infinity being the same thing is like so fundamental to my view of things, and how you're talking about how that circle eventually flattens out and it becomes an infinity, sort of that sort of space becoming time in a certain sense, and unfolding, because your local group is becoming non-local. And 0, what I mean by math is fundamentally a relative measure of change, is that 0 is non-local. And so it is unity, it is oneness, it is what is. And if you're comparing across different frames of time, you have different sizes of 0, because you have different sizes of the universe that are containing the space. So one way to think of it, where 0 is in the middle, non-local, and then you have discrete steps away from 0, which are whole numbers. That's what thought does. Thought operates on and matter operates on the plane of whole numbers. Whole forms separating away from the central form, mitosis of the cells, right? Spreading out along the axes. And then the decimal points, the numbers in between numbers, that is the analog, that is the whole, the negative space between the whole numbers. So there, we've got our marbles as the whole numbers, and we've got our ocean as the continuous numbers in between them. And 0 actually sits in between all the numbers, but it's positive and negative. 0 actually sits on the other side, and it just kind of works out the fact that if you have two zeros and you bring them together, that's an infinity. You know, and this is actually also how the mind actually, I would think of it kind of more stacked like this vertically, but thoughts, feeling, and awareness operate by these same principles, and the integration of the processors can be understood in all these different frames, which is what is so exciting about this conversation to me, because coherence is, to my view, the best way to know if you're getting close to truth in any of your processors. And if you have coherence across multiple frames and levels of reality, that's a really good sign.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
that's cool. I would just throw in really quick to add another frame. Like, that's just another way of saying that God himself is the core at the ground of your being.
Yes.
And
Maybe
this
explain
is also
why.
And that proclaiming myself to be, right? To say I am, to take an identity of self, is the fundamental sin, because it is, and it's death, right? This is why the serpent says, you know, did God tell you, you know, God told you that you're going to die, but you're not going to die. But the death that God spoke of is that upon the identification of self as self, you move away from the 0. You make yourself a 1, right?
That is, you separate, you make yourself a separate whole from 0. So when you become a whole number, which is what a self is. And that, and this is where is thought. You're trapped in the wrong processor.
Yeah, and it's like, if you have, say, I'm not sure if because my math is not, I'm just learning this. I can see it, but I totally, this is new for me. But if you have some kind of ring, oh, got 10 minutes left. If you have some kind of ring that's trying to like contain the whole of your, I forget what the word you used, but the contained circle, and you have like a thing that's going around it, right? And that thing is like stopped at a certain point, then it's now, it's defined itself as a thing, right? Say it's a clock, right? And it decides, instead of just continuing to be open to movement around into the infinite, it says, no, I'm going to be 1. And it's like, now there's a stuckness there, there's a divorce there, there's a pulling away of my sense of myself from reality. So to bring this all the way down into my day-to-day life, the moment that I tell a lie, the moment that I claim to know, you know, I don't know what the correct answer is for whether or not we should all wear masks for COVID, shall we say. When I do that, I am locking in an aspect of reality. And because that's locked in, my frame, my internal sense of reality is now an abstract simulation. Not necessarily abstract, but it's a simulation that's divorced from reality because I've pulled apart.
Yeah, it's like, I wonder what you guys think about like things like dreams and visions, and things you experience while meditating, or things you experience while praying or while sleeping. Like, these experiences are, especially when you start to like see and because like there's like this kind of sense that you kind of go down deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and then you realize you like almost don't realize that you're observing other things besides nothingness, and then it's like, it just kind of like, you like you almost don't like, oh, I'm now starting to see something. Like, you know, you will at one point recognize that you're seeing something, but for me at least, when I'm getting into like that state, it's almost like, oh, I was already seeing this, I didn't realize that. And so you have these really interesting experiences that you're like already seeing and really kind of, at least I don't know how universal it is, but they make you feel things. If you're having a lucid dream, you have agency. sometimes they can be very, very, very like, they can feel a lot. Like you can really feel things inside of some lucid dreams, at least that I've had, where like things either hurt or feel really good or taste a certain way. And so like you're creating these things, and so like your awareness is what's it doing there? Like what are you feeding yourself, or is it coming from somewhere else?
Such a great way of saying that, because to my view, you're feeding yourself your other selves. And because a self is an operating system, it's really confusing to witness another identity from your current one. Because its reference frames and all the network of reference frames is completely different. And so in a sense, to get back to what Ken was saying, when you define yourself as a whole number, or even a set of whole numbers that can reach all the way to zero, because we have a complex network of what a self really is. But anyway, to become a whole in that sense is actually to produce a boundary in the mental structure of where awareness is allowed to look. And what's happening in those experiences is you have your processors as totally different wholes, which may actually have partial wholes within them. But you're from one of those partial wholes, you're looking at another one and being like, what is that? I don't recognize any of these data, any of the symbols, or maybe it comes through you through something that was ingrained in you when you were young. And you know, that processor was really firing at that point in your life, but as you go older, you stop using it as much. This is really common. And so basically you're running it through a different reference frame than your active one in whatever version. And so that is when I'm talking about getting into the subconscious and the unconscious. That's what those experiences are, because it's yourself expanding to become infinity. So you could take zero, and you could take all your thoughts and feelings you've ever had as the number line on either side of zero. And your goal is to have zero encompass all numbers, which is infinity. And so spatial infinity is the expanding on the number scale through the integration of thoughts and feelings within awareness. And the reason the boundary is so important, because that is the forming of what you believe you are. It's what you're allowed to look at. And when you start pushing at that boundary, there's another marble on the other side, another self on the other side of it. And you start pushing and you start realizing, and some of them are actually overlapped in certain ways. So anyway, that's how I conceive of the different identities at play in the system.
I don't want to like not let Ken kind of give, because this is like we're sharing our insight, but I have a couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I wanted to get like into like a few things today. So we'll bookmark them for next time. One thing I want to say though is that I have a very close friend who has a lot of what he describes as like very real like dreams and stuff. And he thinks of them as like past life regressions, like where you're kind of experiencing some sort of like reality that you were at before. So if this description that you're saying is like what you're saying, then these fully formed personalities that he's honestly, I've known this guy since we were like 5. Like I trust him absolutely. He says that he experiences these long almost lifetime, like these like big windows into these other people's lives. Like if it's just this other processor, like what is forming all of this experience that's allowing him to just drop down into like a complete person, not himself, like he's behind it, like being John Malkovich, if you've ever seen that movie. And he's observing all this stuff that's happening, but he's observing himself as someone else. And it's just like continuous, makes perfect logical sense. The guy has a personality, and he tells me all these things about these experiences he's had. And so I don't know what could explain that in this idea of like separate processors.
So the way I would describe that is that a self is constructed of digital and analog information, of whole numbers and numbers between numbers. And so you can create anything within your mind, and that's what you're doing to create yourself. Awareness is kind of the container of space, and anything within space can be constructed and contained as awareness. You could observe it and not be it, or you can interpenetrate and become any part of it, looking at another part of it. So the mind is fully a universe within a universe and has all the same capabilities of space and time. Totally. That's good.
I'll say it was lovely talking with both of you. This was a lot of fun. We'll do it again.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah, look
for
forward
sure.
to it.
Yeah. Whenever you guys
All right.
want.
All right. I'm out. See you guys.
All right.
Yeah, thanks.
My question that I was going to ask is like, what kind of like, in that framework, what privileges reality, you know, our reality that we're experiencing and talking through right now over this conceptual, like purely conceptual reality that we're like experiencing in dreams and stuff?
So why is our imagination not in some sense as real as the shared world?
Well, it can be, and that's what some people say, that they get to that level that they can. That's for example, it's one of the things Thomas Campbell says, is that he can connect into this other state essentially on the fly because he's been doing this for 50 years. So in his mind, like in his mind, it's like almost like it's a real other thing. So
yes, yeah.
I don't know if you believe that or if you think he's deluding himself, because I don't know. He's probably deluding himself, I think, to an extent, but.
So I wouldn't use delude, but I know exactly what you mean by that. And I think it is real what he's experiencing because he is constructing it in his mind and he's navigating it as awareness in his mind. So in that sense, that is real, but it is not a shared reality. It is a constructed reality within a local whole. And so in that sense, what makes it not the shared reality is the fact that others can't access it. And when you think about how all the fragments fit together in a whole, that, to my belief, my understanding, this idea that we are actually creating all of reality can't cohere with the fact that there seem to be other people with the same capabilities. And so I think that he has a very deep understanding of awareness. This is actually similar to something we talked about on Twitter, where when you become the witness, that is stepping back from the mental structure, from space, you're becoming time, essentially. You are actually, as a witness, still space, but it's not important for this. So you're sitting outside of another space that you're viewing as reality, which in your mind is a network of thoughts and feelings. And it's possible for you to change all of your thoughts and feelings to create a reality that seems totally different. And this is what people are doing when they're having spiritual or religious experiences. Often tapping into the sub and unconscious as well, so that they are getting some true reality that they're normally hiding from themselves. So there's many, it's almost sort of like there's an eclipse normally in place that's moving out of the way of various processors to certain degrees and exposing this new world that was always there. But the core reference frame here is, where do you sit within that space? And that's why a lot of what me and Ken were talking about is, if you define the self as a space, you will sit within another space always. But if you define the self as a time, as a process, you can become infinity and contain all of space. And so that would be how I would describe coherence across all the levels in a way that it would eliminate something like solipsism.
So one different way of thinking about that, or I don't, it's not, it's arguing for the sake of trying to understand better. So I'm not trying to. So one thing that I could push it back against that with.
Mhm.
And there's a level of trust here
Sure.
that you have to have for people who tell you stories.
Mhm.
So people tell these stories often. Like I would bet there's at least, I've probably heard this same story probably 20 times, I'd bet,
Mhm.
from people who have done like high doses of like mushrooms or DMT and stuff like that.
Mhm.
They will say that in their group they had a spiritual, like a thought leader, essentially.
Hmm.
And so this description that they have almost makes it feel like one guy is controlling this shared dream that all these other people are having. Like this happens at like
Mhm.
ayahuasca resorts and stuff.
Mhm.
And like there will be all these people and they'll say that they have the same experience. And they'll like say like, oh yeah, like I was just like somehow tapping into John's mind. And all these people were tapping into John's mind. And he was kind
Yeah.
of like this like thought projector or something. And so all these people are tapping into that. So there is some sort of shared aspect of this
Mhm.
reality. Either they're, just imagining things as they're on drugs, or they're, like, what's the word when someone will tell you something and you're really likely to believe it? You're
Oh, kind of already bought in. I know what you mean. Yeah.
like susceptible to
Confirmation bias. Yeah.
confirmation bias kind of, but you are, I guess I'll just say susceptibility, like you're like you can be hypnotized almost, like you
Oh,
can
I
be
see.
made to
Yes.
believe
Mhm.
things. So that is like one argument about these people, is that they are being, like they're all like they believe that they experienced those things, but they actually didn't, and somehow they got into it. But there are a couple of cases that are like confirmed by multiple people that they separately verified these accounts, that these people were having these sorts of experiences and
Mhm.
shared in them without, like what is that space that they're going to? Like there's some sort of something there. I mean, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm asking exactly, but it's a
No, I do understand what you're saying, because what I was referring to before was more solo experiences, similar to what Ken had talked about in our last chat. But what you're talking about there is a different thing, which is our ability to resonate with each other. Now, someone who's easy to hypnotize really is just good at resonating, which is resonating is a form of receptance. It's a form of receiving information without any resistance whatsoever. So you intentionally sort of become like water, and whatever form comes into you, you just form around. So you're accepting what someone else is sending you as experience. And I think in our normal state, because all of us are kind of so trapped in the thinking mind, this is very hard to understand. And we kind of have the other processors dialed down, so they're barely, doing what they're capable of. But when you take drugs, a lot of the time what happens is, when you could say this kind of mentally, it's an extreme flexibility. It's an extreme openness, creativity that's happening. And that's a broadness of awareness. Normally, awareness is localized and just kind of slowly looking around. But on these drug experiences, you're having like whole brain synchronizations. And sometimes it's insane stuff that makes no sense. And other times it's profound realizations of, the deepest problems you've worked on in your whole life sliding together. And that process can actually be transferred from one person to another, because the way that our analog and quantum, our feelings and awareness, pick up information from our environment. And the thinking mind is not capable of this. But
so
well, of course it is through language in its own way, but not at this deeper level.
Right. Yeah, there's a whole bunch about language that I wanted to talk about too. It's crazy how few topics we actually can struggle through. But so are you saying that you think that this sort of experience would like propagate through our physical reality? Like we have some sort of, like, say you want to be like, oh, our minds tap into the Schumann resonance in the ionosphere, and so that changes the electrical state in this person's brain, and so they are able to connect through the Schumann resonance or whatever. Like, you know, like my feeling that I would have, if you had asked me instead, I would have said like whatever we are in like the deepest sense is like communicating there. Like we're somehow like like it's not our brains doing it, it's the things below that is communicating between each other. So that's an interesting viewpoint that they, so
well, just I want to speak to that just briefly because there's so much there. And so when you're super in tune with someone, when you're resonating, it just feels like you're on the exact same vibe. This can happen at many different layers. When that happens in thought, that's what you say when we're finishing each other's sentences, and it just feels like every word the guy says maps exactly to some chapter of understanding that's revealed, you know. And it's, but on the feeling level, you see this at raves or chanting. You can see how people are becoming a whole form through a constant kind of pitch finding. They find each other through the wave and they connect to it and they ride the same wave. That's what music is, really. And that's the analog, that's feeling. That's this like wholeness, this continuousness that can happen. And then, so that's thinking on the first level with words, and feeling on the second level with music. And in fact, good sex and all these kind of like vibe ideas are really about analog alignment and resonance with another person. And at the highest level of awareness, there's a resonance that can happen there as well, which is a total seamlessness of all of space and reality, all of digital and analog information, whole numbers and the numbers in between. You're syncing on all of that with someone else. And in that space, you can create realities together and have shared experiences. Not necessarily a perfect transfer, but in the same way that you can kind of sync up with other people in these other ways, you can sync on all of those levels.
Interesting. That kind of pulls me back to a thing I was thinking about just a couple days ago. So a couple days ago, I was thinking about Islamic people. I was thinking about just like that belief system. And it's really, there's a lot of really beautiful things about Islam that are, I think, under-recognized by Christian people. I almost feel like we should incorporate some of that stuff into our teachings.
Sure.
But in any case, they believe, of course, that Jesus was just a prophet, not, you know, not the son, not, you know, so, and that Muhammad is this, and not exactly the same, but this sort of central figure. And so you think, okay, like, is someone wrong? Like, they're, both of these philosophies are like really, really beautiful, very deep. They're connected, you know, very deeply because they're kind of built off each other. So I was, and there's you know, a whole bunch about like my just general beliefs that we never got into, but I was wondering what you think about this idea of both of them being true at the same time, and that I like to think of not limiting God's power at all. I like to think of God as being like, I have no way to conceptualize what he is capable of. I say he, I don't have any idea what form he takes, or even if he is a form, or if he just doesn't even operate under any rules, or if he has rules and there's some hierarchy. I don't know anything, but I do like to think that more powerful than people tend to give him, and then, which is ironic because everyone's like, oh, God the Almighty, but then you say things like, that's impossible. You're like, listen to what you're saying, like if he's God, like, and he's ultimately powerful, then the way I was thinking is like, why can't Hinduism and Judaism, all the stuff from like the Kabbalah and Islam and Christianity, why can't they be deeply simultaneously true, and that God creates an interface between all of these people that doesn't break? So essentially, so imagine there's basically like all the people, or there's, you know, I think every individual is like on his own thing to an extent, but there's, you know, some sort of collective dynamic there. But the truth, like determination, I think that God's ultimate power is just to kind of saying this is true, and that's kind of like his role is to kind of just determine truth. So like I don't know if that makes sense to the question, but like essentially an Islamic person and me, like we have different belief systems, and we can interact and we can live our whole lives talking and doing all of these things, but like I can't get in that other person's head, and he can't get in my head necessarily exactly. And so if there's some sort of like way that he's preserving my truth, preserving that person's truth, and it being real in their entire universe, and then just some sort of interoperability between them. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, absolutely. That resonates very much so with my view, which is that you know, I think religion is sort of the original science, and it's based on a felt truth. It's based on feelings, based on the whole overall connection of self and reality, which again you can think about, but ultimately feeling is a more effective way of getting into the truth there. And so the way I would think of various religious traditions and practices from my own view is that they are local wholes that contain the non-local truth. But they're using the language of their local culture to filter it through. And so they form different operating systems that have challenges talking to each other, right? Christianity and Islam. And you know, obviously there's been a lot of conflict between various religions over time, and that's why. But you know, the truth to my view is that they actually all believe the ultimate same truth at the highest level. And the difficulty and challenge comes in the localization of language designed to speak to a specific culture of people. Makes it harder to translate across all frames, but they're really effectively based on the same realizations.
yeah, one thing you said that kind of makes me wonder if my point is hard to convey. So I don't think of like the interoperability in terms of like practicality, like in terms of like talking to them and having a shared, you know, cultural values and these sorts of things, but like deeply, like say you have someone who believes in reincarnation, and then you have someone who doesn't believe that, and so you think, oh, it's got to be one of them has to be right, either they're not, either, you know, like for instance, the Norse mythology has an interesting view on the soul and stuff. And let me grab the words because they're kind of cool. So like, for instance, in Norse mythology, they believe in a way, as a sort of reincarnation, that's like the essence of a person passes down. Like it's not the same person. It's like this, it's like this, like each person is contributing to this like shared essence that goes through the like time, and like it kind of like grows. So it's like a shared development that each person contributes a little bit of, and person later in life will have a bigger part of it, you know, will have more of it because it's had more to grow on from previous generations and stuff.
Mhm.
So you like that's a belief system where you have this like what do they call it, like the hominja or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce the name of Norse
No
words.
worries.
But so you have that, and then you have, they don't believe in Jesus, they don't, and then you say you have someone else who has like a deep religious background that believes that like the earth is a spaceship and that we're going somewhere.
Hmm.
And it's not like just a spaceship, it's like a celestial eternal spaceship and we're all on a voyage.
Mhm.
And so, and when you die you go inside the earth or something, right? And so like
Mhm.
my point is that the shared reality that we have could be just completely colored by your beliefs. And
Mhm.
so you interact with someone who has, or you have like there's another person who has this very different viewpoint, and like you guys share the same world, but no one's wrong, no one is incorrect about like what's actually happening, because each person's reality has this like truth in it, but nothing is more true. Like there's no like way of measuring like, oh, Hinduism's truth is more true than Christianity's truth. I don't know if that clarified, or if I'm
Sure. Yeah.
like,
Yeah. No.
I got it the first time. Sorry.
No. That was very helpful, and I definitely followed you through that. Yeah. Really, I think what you're touching on there is that a lot of these things are very deeply felt by people, and they're when something's deeply felt, it tells you, what processor they're using to some degree. And there can be a phrasing in which when I try and send it to you, it doesn't land at all, or even returns as an error, like it's impossible because some of your existing frame seems to refute it. But really what's happening there, and this is why I basically view all of human culture and history as a translation error, because we're speaking on different layers of reality without specifying which one we're referring to. And there's so many ways of combining this truth and packaging it into a local whole through culture to get through the language processor and share it with someone else. That you can package it all these different layers in many different ways, and they're still ultimately true because it's all about how it hangs together. But the various traditions don't necessarily focus on the totality. They focus on the parts. They focus on believe, this specific line as though it's literally true or something like that. And that can be very confusing to actually getting to that whole picture of understanding that is, as Ken would put it, God is the pathway out of these localized conceptions. And so, Ken will touch on this next time maybe, but his big thing is he really worries that people are localizing God and in doing so are reifying the localization of the self. And what God really is meant to be is the path out of localization. It is the route to non-localness, and which is awareness.
That a lot. That's a really good way of thinking about it. It's almost like when you localize, you like calcify your reality.
Yes. Perfect. And that is what an identity is a calcification of a time-based process into space, static frame.
Your generally you talk about about the self as like a function and stuff, like I wish I could beam you my understanding of our like conversations that we had about like monads and stuff.
Yes, yeah.
Because I just feel like there's so much context that like makes this amazing metaphor, and like what you're saying just connects so much to all these aspects of that. I wish I could convey that to you.
Well, we have a little bit of time here, but I want to get into this more next time. But let me just ask you one question, which is when you were talking about the monads, you were talking, I forget exactly what you said, but it was essentially I understand their whole functions, kind of nested functions. But you were talking about them as, in some cases, state-based and in other cases, stateless. And that was very interesting to me.
Well, so essentially, the idea of states, I think, is a misconception.
Mhm.
So the way that this way of thinking would make all of that work is that when you go into a new state, you create a new state and you're linked via the previous state by time. Like it's not, it's this thing didn't change.
Mhm.
It's like the connect, like it's like you don't see this thing anymore,
Mhm.
and like you see it as the same thing, but like it doesn't actually change. Like inside of the computer in this example, when you define something like x equals 10, just have it as just a variable,
Mhm.
that x will always be 10 and it's stored at an address. And so if you have a state monad and you essentially do something with the x, like you are, oh, I want to add 5 to it,
Mhm.
that you're like saying it's x, but it's essentially pointing somewhere else where the number 15 is being stored. But
Mhm.
the like that's what's happening, like just purely mechanically. But there's the metaphor is not great there, but the way that it's very hard to describe, but essentially one really interesting part of the metaphor is that one of the main appeals of this functional programming language like concept is that
Mhm.
it's it allows functions to be what are called first class objects. So typically in like say something like C or C
Mhm.
sharp or JavaScript or well, not JavaScript actually, Java, you have like a function, and there's ways that they get around this, but you define a function and it does something, and it's just what it is, and like you can't like take it from one object into another without like, you know, like it's not, it doesn't do, like you can't move it around like the same way you can move a variable. Like you have an object that represents a car or something, you can like do things and move things around with that car. Like that function is like stuck where it is in terms of like the overall program.
Mhm.
But inside of functional programming, the example I used with you was a wallet as the variable, but you can make it, that variable, a function, and that function could change on each state. So essentially you're getting like more and more like out, essentially.
You're iterating on the iterator in a sense.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
your object that you're kind of like maintaining over time can be something that changes like a function. And so it's just like what you're describing as the self. So so this concept basically has the way that I think of at least what you're describing and how it relates to to like this like state monad idea is that all of our shared information, our shared, what we can all perceive, and like what information exists outside of just like your, you know, you like like you're at the most central layer, like all you are is just like a really you don't do much, like you don't like you like I think like most of your functionality is on this information object. I think
Mm.
that the you is relatively, like I think that my my I don't know, my personality, say, like I don't think that's part of the self really. And I think that I think that we're very, very, very have very few properties, like the self component of this. And I think that
Can you just describe self in your language just to make sure what point for me?
Yeah, I mean I think of it as just like light in a way. And so
Yeah.
and
So true self. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So
that's
self
kind
is
of,
not an identity in your respect. Some people tie them together and you're clearly separating them, right?
yeah,
Okay.
I think that the identity is information. I
Mhm.
think that that's the main divide of how things are, is that there's the self is the object,
Mhm.
and then information is the state monad, and then the iterations that do things is time.
Yes. That
So
is
that's essentially
exactly how I view it. And where you're saying monad, I would just say identity. Because it
right. But I
essentially,
think but you could think of the information and the identity as just one property on this
yeah,
enormous shared information object. So
yeah, right. Because you're saying the monad is like a vertical becoming. And so the identity over time might be more like the monad because it's changed its form, but it is kind of a state that is
yeah,
forming, and you're not actually it because you're actually awareness looking at it or navigating it.
yeah, and so there's plenty of places where the metaphor breaks down, because there's an aspect of the functionality that, like say, we call the self a function in this example. There's a way that the information that exists in this like state monad concept affects the self in a way that, I hate when you're describing something and you're like, I have like four things that I need to simultaneously describe because what I'm going to say isn't going to make any sense. So one thing that I have heard you say, and I don't know if this is like a completely moot point, but I think there's one other part of the self that, or at least a tweak to the model that you described, that I like almost like a lot of what you're saying. I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. Like we may have different inclinations to use different metaphors and stuff, but I think for a large part, like this idea that you're describing of how the self acts as a function is like exactly what I think. But the only big difference that I don't even know why I feel this, but I guess it's just a matter of what I feel, is that I don't think the awareness is looking anywhere. I think things are being brought in front of it. I think the awareness is constant, even when you're asleep, even when you're doing anything at any state. I think your awareness is just this like light. It's just this thing that is there, and so I think there's some part of the self that grabs information and puts it in front of the awareness. I don't think the awareness has the ability to look at the information, I don't know if that's just that's just in part of the way I described it, but it's not important. But I don't know why I feel that to be true, but I feel like there's got to be some mechanism that's part of you that moves things in front of the awareness, as opposed to your awareness having some machination that allows, not like physically, of course, to look around, but like, I don't think you control your awareness. I think you control what you put in front of it. I'm just repeating myself, but
that's very interesting. So how would you differentiate between awareness and attention? Because to me, those are different things, but I often make the mistake of using them as though they're the same. That may confuse people.
we may be completely different here, but I feel like attention is focused awareness, meaning maybe you're doing like in computer terms, you're doing these things called context switching all the time.
Mm.
And so you say your computer's running right now, it's creating this video, it's creating the light that you're seeing, and it's interpreting the sound. Like your computer is basically going, all right, I'm just going to stop this for a second, pick up this, do a little bit of it, put it back down, pick up this, do a little bit of it, put it down. So I think your attention is the current context that is in front of your awareness. Your awareness is this pure thing, and I don't know. I think you get what I'm kind of saying. I think.
Yeah. So that we are aligned then. And so I when I talk about attention, I describe it as at tension, because I think that it is the local, we're looking at a certain part of the mental structure. We're looking at a certain part of the total awareness. A totally fair way to say that. And I think that the way that attention is formed and what drives it is the subpersonalities, the subconscious and the unconscious imposing a boundary on the conscious awareness. Maybe that, in your view, bringing a small subset of information to the awareness. And
like
attention,
kind of limiting your choices to an extent, like
yeah,
giving you a smaller field of choices.
Yeah, you could think of it as an optimization or a compression of information too. But I kind of, the reason I want to use the word tension is because it's the result of these different processors and the wholes contained within them, which are the identities, fighting each other and not being able to, or yeah, that's the better way to say it, not being able to integrate information with the other one. And so the boundary is formed by sort of an incoherence of the operating system language. They speak a different language and they can't integrate. So when you are that one, when you set your reference frame to one of those identities, you're setting the boundaries through having not integrated the other ones into the same process. So in that case, attention is pretty much your subconscious and your unconscious controlling your awareness or what's presented to your awareness. And that's why enlightenment is all about expanding your awareness so that it contains, expanding your attention so that it contains the totality of your awareness.
Yeah.
And that is
non-local,
going non-local.
What you said reminded me of the 1,000 brain model or 1,000 mind model of the brain, I think is what it's called. But essentially what this researcher thinks, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about already, if I'm just explaining something, but this researcher who I was listening to was talking about this, and he basically conceptualizes the brain as a bunch of what are called sparse graphs. So sparse means that there are very few connections between a bunch of nodes. So imagine like a bunch of computers, and all the computers aren't connected to one another, but they're just, this computer is connected to this one might have two that its other connected to, this one has three, but it's it's a sparsely connected system. And so what he thinks is that the way that you know things and the way that you think about things is essentially that you create a bunch of these, and he has like a good reason to think this, and it's really interesting, and I'm going to just completely butcher the way that he describes it, but if you haven't heard it, it's really interesting. He basically describes it as like you create these families of these really sparse graphs, like, and for each of the nodes are like a couple of neurons. And so like you might be thinking about an elephant you saw at the zoo when you were 5, and like that representation is like spread throughout a bunch of your brain, but it's very sparsely connected. And you might get like basically the way that you like connect things and like think of things is that because they're sparsely connected, there's very low intersections of ideas. But since they're sparsely connected, each connection is very important. So when you have two related ideas, they're going to share these similar connections because there's like it purposely keeps it from being overcrowded and a mess. And the way he describes this thing is like really, really fascinating, like mechanical model of, not mechanical, of how the brain works, but it kind of reminds me of what you're describing, but you're describing it in like a metaphysical system. So
very much the same idea, because really what the body does, what the language of the analog processor of feelings is actually spatial. And that's why we experience feelings as tensions within the body, because it's mapped to a physical space. And, we have meanings, which are, changes in your mental structure. When something, you interpret something, that is you changing yourself and your conception of reality in that sense. So that's another map. So we're really just, as a body and a mind, different flavors and forms of maps interacting with each other. And mapping is really the language of feeling. Antonio Damasio's work goes into that in detail. He's been really helpful for me there. But yeah, the sparse grid that you're talking about there is just incomplete maps. And that's the fragmented identities, or when you don't understand something very well, you have just a couple nodes and lines attached. But the process of integration is taking all those different maps and building something that's cohesive and whole at all the layers and all of the, on all the processors. That's becoming one with yourself. That is a fullness of integration. Because fundamentally, in my view, formation creates information. Time creates space. Same statement. And then in consciousness, through these three processors, we take information and combine them back into formation, which is also why I believe we have free will. And that is us as consciousness looking back at time, containment, quantum containment of reality.
Interesting. I'm glad to hear that you say that you think we have free will. I feel like that's like a very sticky tension point for a lot of conversations.
I actually, for a while, did not think that. And I remember, and I can still change states between that feeling. If I do what you were saying, the what if, I can still do that. And I can actually feel what that does to me as a system. And it does close, it closes certain possibilities that exist in the system if you don't believe that. So, so free will is actually, not believing in free will on some level is a form of paralysis.
I think so too. I wonder, so do you think in terms of like evil as like a force that's, or do you think it's just like a, what's the word? And something comes out of other, like you have these pieces and then something comes out of it, and what's the word I'm looking for? But do you think that it's like some sort of deeper force like God, or do you think it's like some, like people being selfish and like it's just created out of our experiences and information?
So that's a good one. We should pick up with Ken too, because he has lots of really interesting. Yeah. But anyway, we'll dive into it again.
Yeah,
Um,
interesting.
with evil, there's so many different
maybe we
layers.
should put a bookmark on that because
Yeah, let's do that with him.
He's like a much more into theology than I think either of us are, and
and I really want to talk next time as well about what could potentially happen after death and the mechanisms there, because I think that with all three of these frames would be a really interesting thing to navigate, something that's kind of eluded people's, even possibility frame.
Yeah, I've thought about death in a ton of different ways. Do you feel like you have some aspect of it that you get, or do you think it's like a probability that it's true?
Yeah, let's pick up on this next time, because death and certainty, I always connect those two topics, because the way in which I think we should hold ideas about things like that relates to how I think we should think of certainty and probability. And yeah, it's just a super long thing to get into, but I would love to at some point.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, next time when we talk as well, I do kind of want to go over at least some of my way that I'm conceptualizing some of these things, and you're probably gonna laugh. You guys are gonna laugh at my probably one of my most strongly held beliefs is very illogical, and it's kind of logical, but it's like people give me like a come on, like whenever I talk about it. So just to give you a sneak peek, because I do want to talk about it with Ken as well, because it'd be an interesting conversation, is there's a lot of very, very interesting coincidences when it comes to the moon, the sun, and the earth in terms of sizes and symbology and actions that they do. And it blows my mind. I wrote a thread on a very short, like retweet thread talking about this today. But there's some really, really weird things that are coincidences about the moon and the sun that I'm like, I can't believe that those are coincidences. Like, they just don't seem like they're coincidences. And the crux of that argument is that we have the moon has some really interesting connections to females, and the sun has some really interesting connections to males. So for females, mom, moon, month, menstruation are all the same, come from the same root. You have the
sorry, you cut out there. What word was that?
So I'm just it's kind of crazy. Let me describe it here. Give me 1 second. But basically, you have that the moon is 27.3% the size of the Earth. You have this, I think it's pronounced sidereal orbit of the moon, 7.3 days. The average length of pregnancy is 273 days. Like, that's a really weird coincidence. And the moon is like really deeply connected with females. So you have like the period is about 28 days on average, about 27, that same number. That controls the size, relative size of the Earth to the moon, the moon's orbit, the length of pregnancy, the length of periods, and it's all a female symbol. And so then you have, beyond that, you have the sun, and then there's an obvious connection between the sun and this, like, maleness, like Jesus is the sun. It's called the sun. Like we've landed on those words. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun is, but it's 400 times closer. That is like unbelievably unlikely that you would have. And what that allows you to have is a perfect covering of the moon going in front of the sun during an eclipse. So you have to have like really, really, really like, I've seen some people talk about the likelihood of it. It's like impossible. You know, it's like one of those like probability of it happening is 0, but it happened here. So you have this male symbol, then you have the, and there's a bunch more here with the male aspect of it. But then you have this female symbol. Then you have an eclipse. Since they're the same size, when they intersect, they create something called the Vesica Pisces. The Vesica. So when the circumference of this circle touches when the circumference of each circle touches the center of the other circle, right? So it's like two intersect like a Venn diagram.
Infinity looks like it.
Well, kind of, yeah. It's like a.
I understand.
But anyways, yeah, you have, and the Vesica Pisces is like a symbol of like the female birthing process, and that's where like the fish for Jesus comes from. That's like what it is. Like the Vesica Pisces, the Pisces is the fish in this thing, and so you have the moon covering the earth, and you have it forming the shape of the representation of the female birth canal. You have the Vesica Pisces, which is a symbol of life in Jesus and birth, and you have this weird connection with the sun and how big it is and how small it is. You have all these strange connections between the moon and women, and then this is where it gets into like this metaphysical concept, is that my idea of time is very interesting in comparison to what I've been talking about within this framework. Within this is one of my contradictory as if beliefs that I've explored a lot. So you have this interesting idea of time that I think is true like half the time, where I think that time and consciousness are the inverses of each other. I think that like consciousness and like awareness and like, you know, I think of consciousness as kind of like this like all-encompassing term of like awareness, bringing information and integrating with your current information. Like I think of all of that as consciousness, but I think that consciousness
is a way
is
to inner knowing.
Yeah. So I think of consciousness as this as the inverse of time. It's the thing that makes time coherent. It's like a store of time, basically, because like there's no other, like I think if you didn't have any consciousness, there would be no time. I think that they're like the same thing, not the same thing, but like inverses of each other, like they're like a dipole system. Like they kind of, one can't exist without the other. And so I think that there are anything that reduces, like kind of like creates light, like, you know, people create light, and, you know, they're like physically, like we glow in the dark, very, very, like we can't see it, but like life glows slightly.
Yeah, our eyes actually emit light as well as receive it.
Yeah, and I think that the sun and that stars in general are these broad scale consciousnesses that are tracking cosmic time. And so you have like, as far as, and this goes back to what Thomas Campbell was saying about Thomas Campbell, that you only render the level of detail that you require. And so I think that these like suns create these like broad strokes consciousness that like renders reality and like makes it coherent over time, and that smaller life and conscious like forms of consciousness are these essentially like detailed renderers. And so my crazy thought that I was saying, you guys are gonna laugh at how insane this is that you have the sun and the moon. When the moon is covering and it's perfectly covered, you have the sun, it creates a blind spot. The sun's consciousness is blocked below, because if it's not shining like its light down there. So I think that like there's something there. I don't know what exactly, but like I've created this whole picture in my head that like feels very interesting, regardless of whether it's true or not. And I kind of like just carry on as if it's a belief.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense? My whole description?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, it makes sense on many, many layers of reality. We'll have to pick up some of them next time because I got to go shortly, but I do want to give you a response. And so, well, firstly, there's a precedent for this because many cultures throughout history have thought of the sun and moon in this way, and representing divine masculine and feminine. And so you're in good company historically there. But even further than that, I think you're really talking about, when you're talking about the sun and moon, you're talking about, and planets, you're talking about these enormous structures within space that are, because of the way space-time works, because space drives time, as maybe not as much, but in a similar way to what time drives space. So when you think of the sun, I forget the exact number, but it's something like 98% of our solar system's mass is the sun. So if you're thinking of the sun as like a matter drive, it's controlling time more than anything else is in our solar system. And the moon, obviously, because of its proximity to Earth, has a similar effect and pushes all the water around and drives. Water's what drives life, and so the moon driving water, driving life, is the mother. And in certain, it's easy to get into the metaphor there. And then another layer there is when you're talking about the sun being blocked by the moon, that is a perfect visualization from my perspective of the way in which identities or static selves block awareness. But what is controlling the moon is not just the sun, but is the earth. And so when you're talking about there's something that's controlling what awareness is shown, you can kind of think of the moon spinning around, like the identity spinning around maybe the whole, a local whole is the moon, and the earth is this, at least this larger whole that is being blocked by the self that's kind of so close to the eye that it can't see it.
Oh yeah, that's a really, really interesting perspective. That makes a lot of sense too. It's like, yeah, I don't know. There's metaphorical power for sure. And this is one of the things that I very briefly got into at the beginning of that. Like one of the things I like to go down is kind of this like esoteric knowledge rabbit hole.
Yeah, I looked at a little bit of that.
Whole ton of like really interesting things. Like for instance, there's a guy I like named Scott Onslaught is his name, and he has this really like amazing documentary that like is just like a really good overview of like so many hidden esoteric knowledges and forgotten things, and like really into architecture and geometry from like old buildings and what they were doing, and masonry and Freemasons and all that sort of stuff. But forgot where I was going with that. But I was just going to give another example. Like he talks about like this, how he almost disregards the foot, and we think of it as like a silly unit of measurement, right? Like it's this really, really, really old unit of measurement that we've had forever, and no one really knows where it came from. And people are like using like the meter and the whole metric system and like really think like, oh, this is so much better than the old imperial system is. And one of his things that he did is just like, there's so much information about the world hidden within all of these old imperial units, and he goes on and just talks about them. And he like, the most amazing one is that he's like, this is almost proof that they knew how big the earth was like
Hmm.
a long time ago, like a really long time ago, like Sumatrian pre-Egypt. But he basically like, this is another coincidence, but he thinks it's this. If you take, say you wanted to find a unit of measurement and you want it to be really important, you want it to be like related to like the Earth, for example. If you know how big the Earth is, and you're like, I'm going to cut it up into a bunch of small pieces. And you said that's going to be a foot. I want to know how many small pieces am I going to do? And you're like, the Earth's a big circle. It takes a year to go around. There's 360 degrees in a circle. 365 degrees, 365 days as the sun goes around. The foot is 360 times 365 times 1,000, just like a decimal place mover. That many feet is the size of the circumference of the Earth. 60 times 365 days times 1,000 feet is the circumference of the Earth. Like it's like 99.97% accurate or something like that. Like that's an incredible thing. And he's like, there's just all these old things like this. So that's definitely a direction I would like to at least explore a little bit. I don't know if you guys go into that sort of stuff at all, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I think the Earth is actually technically it's slightly oblong as well, so that may be why it's 365. I don't know, but yeah, the reason why math is so compelling, because you can notice these patterns at certain levels of abstraction that are very hard to notice with the eye, right? So the visual information is really good at certain things, but abstract information is actually really good in other ways too. It's seeing disparate patterns. And there's so much there, even to the level of like the way people understand evolution. Really, that actually applies in a certain frame to physics as well, in terms of how what happens is what is least resisted. So it's ultimately kind of a resource conservation that's taking place. And the actual life forms that formed on Earth are based specifically on the stars that exploded in our local area and arrived here, because the composition of our atmosphere itself is driven by those factors. And so I think science right now has this like very localized understanding of things. But with what you're talking about there, the reason why people might laugh or just not understand is because you're talking about something that is just too far away from their local frame. But it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that they can't make the connection, and they're not willing to spend the time to do it. That's the laughter is permission to not look at what you're saying.
That's interesting.
Self-permission.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to do for too longer. But yeah, it's a fascinating conversation for sure.
Yeah, honestly, I love these conversations, and the reason why I'm having them is largely because I'm like, why isn't everyone talking about this? I just don't know how. I'm just so driven and so interested in these topics because I think that they are ultimately our self-understanding is the wrapper around how we do everything. The more that our own operating system understands itself, the more that we can, the more free will we have, because the sub and unconscious are controlling our consciousness less. And so I kind of think of this wholeness as really what everyone is seeking in life and not even knowing that they're seeking it. That's why the conversation is so meaningful to me. So really, really thank you and Ken for your time, because I'm loving it.
Yep. Let's definitely meet up. I want to share this video with you and Ken, because it would be fascinating if you guys had any insight on it. So I'll send in the chat.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, thanks, Shane. It was great getting to know you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And look forward to next time.
Cool. All right, man. Talk to you. Bye.
Thanks. See ya.